Welcome to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Naomi Fowler. Coming up later on the Taxcast, we'll be getting some insights into the closed world of wealth managers who serve the super rich. But first, here's a quick roundup of tax justice news. Some good news. The Australian Parliament passed a corporate tax bill this month which includes a series of transparency measures and means mandatory country-by-country reporting for Australian multinationals. Probably starting from next year, they'll have to publish their revenues and details about their operations in each jurisdiction where they do business. In France, the National Assembly voted for public country-by-country reporting for French companies. It's not quite there yet, though. The vote now has to go through the Senate. Luxembourg's not at all happy about the EU Commission ruling that its cosy tax agreement with Fiat Chrysler was illegal state aid and broke EU competition rules. Now, Luxembourg's supposed to be recovering 20 to 30 million euros of back taxes from the company, but they're appealing the decision instead. No doubt there are plenty more secret tax agreements yet to be investigated, and in fact this month the EU Commission announced it's also investigating a tax deal between McDonald's and Luxembourg. In Brazil, the mayor of Sao Paulo's made the city's property register public. Like many cities around the world, high-value real estate's being bought up by some pretty dubious characters, including arms dealers, oligarchs and money launderers. I don't expect Brazilians will be surprised to find a horde of anonymous shell companies in their property register. In London, millions of dollars worth of properties under criminal investigation. Through Freedom of Information laws, journalists there finally learned the extent of UK property ownership through offshore vehicles, or £122 billion of it. The British government's consulting on creating a register of the real owners of land in the UK, but we're not holding our breath. The real question is, does anonymous ownership really have any place in the 21st century? In Paris this month, the heads of state of 196 countries came together to make a new agreement on global climate change. The Tax Justice Network's John Christensen was at the Parallel Citizens Climate Summit to point out that, in fact, huge sums of public money are available to finance a transition to a cleaner energy market and mitigate the effects of climate change if tax dodging by multinational companies was properly tackled. The International Monetary Fund estimates that alone's losing governments around the world $700 billion a year. Funnily enough, last year's global fossil fuel subsidies are also estimated at, you guessed it, $700 billion. And that, of course, includes tax breaks. And finally, the so-called European Robin Hood tax, a financial transactions tax on banks, came a step closer this month when 10 Eurozone countries agreed the basics of the tax. The British government's threatening to take its European neighbours to court if they go ahead with it. Those are the Tax Justice headlines for this month. Now we're going to talk to John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network for his take on this month. OK, John, last month on the Taxcast we talked about the British Banking Association report. The City of London was in crisis, apparently, losing out to Singapore, Hong Kong and New York. And obviously we know what sort of answers they would be putting forward. Regulation light, tax light, sort of medicine that got us into the problems that we had with the financial crisis. And now the British Bankers Association should be rubbing their hands with glee this month because they've got one of their own right into a top government position, working for the Office of Tax Simplification, which is quite an Orwellian name in itself. For Her Majesty's Treasury, this person will be involved in helping with tax reform, no less.
Yep, this is the perfect Christmas gift for the British Banking Association and for the city generally. I mean, last month I said, look, if the City of London really wants to compete, perhaps they should lower their fees because they charge the highest fees in the world. And perhaps, they should just improve on the service they offer to the rest of the world. But that's not their notion of competition. Their notion of competition is to be subsidised. And the tax system is the ideal subsidy. What they want for Christmas is, first of all, the abolition of the banking levy that was imposed after the financial crisis to perhaps recoup some of the money which the banking world cost us. They'll want more reliefs. They'll want a whole range of exemptions added. In their dreams, further cuts to the corporation tax rate, eventually the abolition of the corporate income tax entirely, because what they don't want is to pay tax at all. They want other people to pay tax. What won't be on offer, of course, is simplification of taxes, because let's begin by saying that for most ordinary people, our tax affairs aren't complicated. It's the tax affairs of rich people, and the powerful corporations are complicated precisely because they like to avoid tax so much, so they do all these extraordinary things, and the governments have had to respond by making the systems more complex. What she won't be doing is looking at how we can create a tax system which actually stimulates the kind of development that's good for Britain as a whole. She's there to meet the class interests of the City of London.
Right, and just to give listeners an idea of this person, Angela Knight, who used to be the head of the British Bankers Association, stepping into this position in the United Kingdom for the Treasury. She made a career out of defending the indefensible. I mean, at every turn, she tried to defend the banks from all kinds of fines for different misdemeanours. She strongly opposed the bankers' bonus tax, tried to defend the banks from having to pay out compensation when they missold insurance. I mean, there's a long list of things. And I read that somebody had written that giving her this position was on a par with Kissinger winning the Nobel Peace Prize. So this is the type of person that we're talking about.
Absolutely. I think this is a very kind of British type of corruption, to be honest, that way you create this office for tax simplification, as you say, the term is Orwellian, and pack it out with people who can be trusted to do the right thing for the right people. And Angela Knight fits that type perfectly, sounds plausible, but all the way through she will be pushing very, very hard for a tax system that suits the rich and the powerful. And it's yet another step in the direction of Britain becoming a world-leading tax haven.
Right, and the Financial Secretary to the Treasury said that I'm sure under her chairmanship the Office of Tax Simplification will help us create a tax system that delivers for British business and people. Well,
I'm sure it will do just that. But of course, when he's talking about British business, we're talking here about the City of London's interests.
Right, let's talk about the Zuckerbergs and their charitable donation. If you were to believe the headlines across a lot of the newspapers around the world, you would think that Mark Zuckerberg has pledged $45 billion to charity, but in the same way that we find out as children that Father Christmas isn't real. This isn't all it seems either, is it?
Not at all. I mean, the newspapers have been positively gushing about Mark Zuckerberg's affairs, and maybe he will eventually give everything away to charity. But at this stage, that isn't the case. Because if he wanted to give the money away to charity, there's nothing to stop him from giving it away to charity. What he's done is he's given the money away to an ordinary limited liability company, which he will own, he and his wife will control, and he describes this setup as charitable, but so far there's no evidence that any of this money will necessarily end up being given to anything which most ordinary people would regard as charitable.
And not only that, but the limited liability company, their records are private. They could have set up a non-profit or a charity where the tax returns are public, they're online, they're available.
That's absolutely right. The whole purpose, and what's curious about this structure, that he's chosen this limited liability corporation structure. As you say, there's no reporting requirement. Charities and non-profit structures have a whole host of reporting requirements. They need to disclose grants to other entities. They need to disclose their directors' names. They have to disclose where they're dealing with themselves, where conflicts of interest arise, and so on. These limitations or restrictions don't apply to limited liability corporations. They are completely private. So we have to take Mr. Zuckerberg's word that he's actually doing charitable deeds. He might equally simply be giving unlimited sums for political lobbying purposes because he can do it using the structure he's chosen. He might also use the same structure to invest in startups in an unlimited sort of way. And of course, those investments will yield him future income. My view about this is that it's very hard at this stage not to be slightly cynical about it. He's chosen an unusual structure to make charitable donations. But what he has done, and this is a global thing, is Facebook has been avoiding tax in many, many countries. And this structure will allow him to continue to avoid tax. So what's quite clear is he is intent on not paying tax. Philanthropy is all well and good, but not when it's built on the back of tax avoidance. Facebook was set up with a gigantic intent to avoid paying tax, and then to say, oh, but look, I'm spending all this money on charity, when there's no evidence necessarily that there will be any charitable donation, I think is the height of cynicism.
Right, yes, and a few years back, Bill Gates called for multimillionaires around the world to give away their fortunes, and some of the German millionaires reacted in quite an interesting way. One of them said it's a bad transfer of power from the state to billionaires. You know, if you're looking at this type of donation culture among the very rich to possibly override and replace what the state chooses to do with taxes that should be payable by these very rich people.
Well, this is the problem, of course, because when the rich decide to opt out of democracy and decide that they will decide how they'll spend their money, leaving the rest of us to pay our tax contributions in an agreed democratic way, where we know that some of the money we pay will not be put towards what things we would necessarily support, bombing Syria, for example, but will be paid towards education and health services. They're simply opting out of all of that, and that is fundamentally anti-democratic.
So, donate to charity by all means, but pay your taxes first.
That's right.
Okay, finally this month we're going to talk about a very interesting survey of accountants, 1,696 of them, all around the world, about their profession, asking them all sorts of different questions. And to summarise, one might say that corruption appears to be rife in the accountancy profession. And this was an anonymous survey, so they felt freer to express their opinions. We got results from this survey of things like 66% of the accountants in the survey believed between 5 and 10% of those in the profession have helped clients create accounts that are deliberately misleading. 3/4 of them believe their organisations don't do enough to ensure whistleblowers are protected from victimisation or dismissal. I mean, it's pretty devastating.
It is absolutely devastating. Half of the sample surveyed said that they had been pressured or knew someone who had been pressured to either adjust something in a way which should not have happened or ignore an adjustment that should not have been made. You know, this is a devastating critique of the way in which the accounting profession has evolved in the last few decades. It's quite clear that accountants have moved, and so have bankers, by the way, and lawyers, have moved a long way away from what society expected of them 40 or 50 years ago. They were there to not only make money from selling accountancy service, but they were there also to, in some respect, protect the integrity of public life. In fact, they used to be called the policemen of capitalism. It's clear from this survey and from my own research talking to a very large sample of accountants, they now see their role as purely to make money. See themselves as having little or no role in protecting the integrity of public life. It means we can no longer really trust accountants. And this survey, I think, confirms that as gatekeepers of capitalism, as gatekeepers of public interest, the accounting profession have pretty much given up on any role in that area. This is an astonishing abrogation of their professional duties. I think that as professional people in an industry that is self-regulating, they have a duty to fight back against their partners when their partners try to push them in that direction. And societies, I think, now need to protect themselves from this loss of professional integrity.
How do we do that?
Fight back, perhaps to the point where we say that you no longer have the right to self-regulate. A simple example of how irresponsible the tax profession has become. When the Public Accounts Committee in 2014 investigated some of the tax avoidance schemes, a whistleblower from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and that's a very, very rare thing to have a whistleblower come forward, who said that at one stage recently PricewaterhouseCoopers was selling tax avoidance schemes which they knew had a 75% likelihood of failing in front of the court. If these schemes were ever challenged, the likelihood was that there were 75% of them would fail in front of a court of law. And yet they still went ahead and sold the schemes. And that tells you that even at the level of PricewaterhouseCoopers, we have a level of professional integrity which is virtually non-existent. Either the professional associations now come in with clear guidelines, or we're going to have to intervene democratically and say, this is what we expect. This is the kind of behaviour that we must force upon these professions, because they are no longer able to professionally guide themselves.
And also we must protect whistleblowers better. We need whistleblower laws, strong whistleblower laws, don't we?
Very strong whistleblower laws. I spoke to a number of accountants about the attitudes within the profession, and many of the tax accountants said, look, we now have a situation where the authorities, the national authorities, the tax authorities are regarded as the enemy. And it's therefore legitimate for us to do anything we want to attack the enemy. That's their attitude towards democracy.
John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network. Now it's time for the TaxCast special feature. This month, the TaxCast peeps over the fence to look at the professionals who manage the wealth of the world's richest people. Like their clients, they usually like to keep a low profile. What's it like serving people who have everything? It's estimated that 1% of the world's population will own more than 50% of the world's wealth by 2016. And there's a small army of wealth managers who work for them. Not very much is known about the part they play in exacerbating global inequality, but Associate Professor of Copenhagen Business School Brooke Harrington wanted to get inside this closed world. So she trained to be a wealth manager.
Well, there didn't seem to be any other way to study what I wanted to study, because people who are committed professionally to discretion and client confidentiality aren't going to answer questions by strange sociologists who phone them up.
Right, so you did years of training. You went to conferences and meetings. You were eating with them, taking classes with them, staying in the same hotels as these wealth managers. Immersion ethnography, you call it. So studying them at close quarters. And there aren't so many of these wealth managers in the world, really. Probably only about 20,000.
Well, there are not that many people who can pay for this sort of work. I think the number of ultra high net worth individuals, which means those with assets of 30 million US or more, not including their primary residence, there are only just over 100,000 of them in the world. And as for high net worth individuals, which are the larger category of people with 1 million or more US in investable assets, I think there are a couple million of those, but it's not a massive client base. It's not totally knowable how many wealth managers there are in the world. It's only knowable how many belong to this professional society that I studied. So that 20,000 figure, as you said, is relative to the membership of STEP.
And the motivations of some of these wealth managers are really interesting. Some of them were looking for a better work-life balance, and going into wealth management offered them that.
Many people spoke openly about how when they were just in straight law or straight finance, they were working 80 or 90-hour weeks. They made a lot more money, but they never saw their families. And one of the things that made a big impression on them from working with ultra-high net worth clients was that often those people had very strained or dysfunctional relationships with their family members, especially with their children and their spouses, and that the wealth managers, didn't want that for themselves. They wanted better human relationships, and they got that by going from like corporate law or from financial trading into wealth management, because it's more of a 40-hour-a-week kind of gig.
What kind of salaries were they on, these wealth managers?
I have an idea from looking at the job want ads that you see sometimes in the financial papers in places like Switzerland or in the professional journals. Now, granted, some people would say that the very best jobs are not advertised at all. And they demand really extraordinary things, like people who are multilingual and highly cultured and with many years of experience, like more than a decade of experience working with wealthy people. And they're offering compensation in the mid to low six figures, like $200,000 or $300,000 a year. And I compare that to the average salary for a managing director, which is like a mid-level executive at Goldman Sachs, is about $500,000 a year. And that doesn't even include the bonuses they get, which are usually double that. So you don't really get rich working this way for rich people. You make a lot more money working in corporate law or working in high finance, like being a currency trader.
Still a higher income than most people, but not as much as I thought it might be. And you describe wealth management as a profession on the defensive, which is good to hear. But why do you say that?
Well, I think the reputation of people involved in finance generally is pretty low these days. But there's a perception, particularly that people who are involved in facilitating tax avoidance and law avoidance are engaged in something that, even if it's not strictly illegal, is definitely ethically unsavory. I encountered a lot of resentment and bitterness on the part of people I interviewed. They're very acutely aware that when they tell people what they do, if they don't just say, I'm a lawyer, but they say, I'm a wealth manager, or I work for wealthy people, there's a kind of stigma attached to that, especially if people know exactly what they do for wealthy people, which is helping them avoid legal restrictions.
Right, because it's not just about fixing it so that their clients pay little or no tax. I mean, people like Mitt Romney, the presidential hopeful and multimillionaire, famously paying less personal income tax than most US citizens. But wealth management, you say, is also about facilitating a kind of stateless, lawless lifestyle.
Tax avoidance was really only the tip of the iceberg. I didn't realize how much bigger the problem is, that it really what wealth managers do extend to much more generally to law avoidance in general. And that creates problems of legitimacy for whole governments, because it's bad enough when people think that they're getting shafted because the rich aren't paying their fair share of taxes. It's quite another matter when you say to people, well, there's one law for the rich and one law for everybody else, and they're not the same. I think that's the kind of thing that can potentially topple governments and lead to crises in politics. If you're wealthy at a sufficient level, you're essentially a tourist across the world. You don't have to feel obligated to contribute to any society. If you don't feel rooted in a particular country, you're like a tourist everywhere you go. You take the benefits of being in a certain place, and you don't feel obligated to contribute to the upkeep of that way of life. So, you may go to, some island in the Caribbean, enjoy the sun and sand, and then you leave. So you don't pay income tax there. You wouldn't feel obligated to do so because you're not a citizen of that place. Well, imagine that sort of vacation mentality generalized to an entire way of life.
Right, because one of many things wealth managers are facilitating are passports of convenience, a service many traditional tax havens are pushing quite hard because of the low or no income tax advantages they offer. When the Facebook founder Eduardo Saverin renounced his US citizenship for a Singaporean passport, that was, you say, a classic wealth management strategy. Here's a quick reminder.
And in the big finish tonight, this story gets my blood boiling. Facebook co-founder Eduardo Saverin has renounced his United States citizenship. Facebook is going to go public on Friday. And by giving up his citizenship, Saverin will avoid paying taxes on billions of dollars on capital gains. Singapore They have no capital gains taxes, even though the capital gains tax in this country is at a historically low rate.
The numbers don't lie. Saverin has turned his back on the country that welcomed him and kept him safe, educated him, and helped him become a billionaire. This is a great American success story gone horribly wrong.
And the very rich don't need to worry too much about expensive divorce settlements or lawsuits either, because their wealth managers can ensure their assets are untouchable pretty much no matter what. For example, Brooke Harrington points out in her research how no one, not even the US government, has ever broken a Cook Islands trust. Now, I'm sure there are very wealthy people who are honourable, but there are many instances as well where the fees they pay their wealth managers have bought them all sorts of offshore vehicles and anonymity to be able to do things like protect the proceeds of crime, pay bribes, avoid legal judgments and debts, and of course dodge taxes. So Brooke, you did 65 interviews in 18 countries for your research. Where did these wealth managers kind of draw the line? Did any of them express any kind of remorse or doubt about the type of work they were doing?
Some of them did. There was a spectrum of responses ranging from people who were they felt very misunderstood and they were very angry about how they felt their work was portrayed publicly as being immoral, helping people pay less tax than the statutory rate. And they were very resentful of moral arguments that cast their work in a negative light. On the other end of the spectrum, I also encountered people who were conscience-stricken about their role in helping the rich stay rich in a world of growing inequality. And they were taking active measures to try to undo some of the damage that they felt their clients were doing in the world. So one person I interviewed was very direct about encouraging his clients to give generously to philanthropic causes. Another person I interviewed would actually lecture his clients about inequality, and he'd talk to them about Amartya Sen and the work of people like Joseph Stiglitz to try and do some sort of consciousness raising with wealthy people about their role in a larger system of socioeconomic inequality. So he took a sort of educator role. Other people would make sort of small gestures that were mostly symbolic, like refusing to sign off on certain documents that they thought were unethical, knowing that there were other people in their organizations who would sign off on those documents. So the client would get what they wanted, but the individual practitioner could console him or herself that their hands were clean.
And one of the wealth managers you interviewed told you he'd said to his colleagues, "If I ever become like our clients, just shoot me."
Yeah, that fellow was very contemptuous of some of his clients. Not all of them, but definitely some of them he regarded as being just deeply corrupt and unsavory people.
And one wealth manager in the British Virgin Islands threatened to kind of have you thrown out of the country. Why was that?
This was one of the guys who was super defensive about what he perceived as an injustice done to him personally and to the profession generally by virtue of having what he called my leftist perspective on his work. And that consisted, it seemed, entirely of my using the words wealth management and socioeconomic inequality in the same sentence. This gentleman, at the end of our interview, he sort of leaned back and crossed his arms again and told me that there had been discussions among the wealth managers I had contacted in this small community on the British Virgin Islands about having me thrown off the island because of my views about the profession. So he didn't name names or say explicitly whose idea this had been, but he didn't seem exactly horrified by the prospect. He wasn't telling me in order to express his objections to the idea, if you see what I mean.
Right. And like many of the enabler professions in the tax avoidance industry, wealth managers exploit the law in ways that were never intended by lawmakers, and quite possibly they're doing things that might not survive a challenge in court, if it ever got to court. And even if it did, they probably made sure the money of their clients is out of reach of the law enforcement bodies. What kind of effect does that have, do you think?
Wealth managers defeat the letter of the law while remaining within it. If there isn't a sense of solidarity, if there is a sense that there is a law that is just simply not applicable to a certain segment of society, then you're breaking down the solidarity and legitimacy on which democracies depend. And that opens the door for things like fascism, not as an automatic development, but it creates some of the conditions that allow fascism to thrive. And that's very worrisome.
That's Associate Professor of Copenhagen Business School, Brooke Harrington. She'll be publishing more on her research next year. You've been listening to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network. We'll be back next month.